The French invasion of Russia began on June 22, 1812. The Russian defensive strategy was to abandon the western frontier with a scorched earth policy, preventing the French troops from being able to live off the land. When the French entered Moscow on September 13, 1812, they found the great city to be completely deserted. By the time the French and Russian armies clashed in October 1812, the French forces were so weak, sick and starved that they were no match for the Russians. The French army soon broke and fled with the Russians in hot pursuit. Alexander's forces would lead a renewed Allied offensive that led all the way to Paris. Tsar Alexander I died on December 1, 1825, at the age of 47. He was followed on the throne by his younger brother, Nicholas I. Soon after he took the throne, more than 500 military officers rose up in what was known as the Decembrist Revolt. They wanted to bring in a constitutional monarchy to be ruled by former Tsar Alexander's uncle, Constantine. Nicholas responded by sending in the artillery, with the result that many of the rebels were killed and the rebellion put down. Then, the new Tsar set up a commission to investigate the root causes of the rebellion. Its conclusion was that the youth of Russia were being educated in the failings of Russian society and were clamoring for social and political reforms. This led Nicholas to put in place a new code of laws. There, he wanted to eliminate serfdom, but knew that he had to move gradually in order to keep the landlords from revolting. Nicholas supported the cause of Greek independence in the Ottoman lands. This led to the outbreak of the Russo-Turkish War of 1828 to 1829. This resulted in a Russian victory at the town of Kulivatcha and the signing of the Treaty of Adrianople. The peace did not last long for the Russian army. In 1831, there was a loud uprising in Russian-controlled Poland, forcing Nicholas to send in troops. Then, after 17 years of relative quiet, there was a second revolution in France, with Napoleon III seizing power. Napoleon managed to ingratiate himself with the Ottoman Turks, who ended up once more declaring war on the Russian Empire, this time in 1853. Things were looking good for the Russians until England and France joined the war on the Ottoman side. Things got even worse when Austria joined the fray and gave Nicholas the ultimatum of leaving Wallachia and Moldavia, or facing the combined wrath of the European allies. Nicholas gave in and stood down his army, but the war against France and Britain was not over. It morphed into what has come known as the Crimean War. In the winter of 1854, a combined French and British navy attacked the Russian port of Sevastopol. The siege was still underway when, on March 2, 1855, Nicholas suddenly died. Soon thereafter, the Russians were forced to evacuate Sevastopol. They had more success, though, against the Ottomans, seizing control of the Turkish fort of Kars. Peace negotiations were then entered into, resulting in the Treaty of Paris of 1856. The treaty conditions allowed the Russians to swap Sevastopol for Kars, but also limited the unstable presence in the Black Sea and lost them the southernmost portion of Bessarabia, which was ceded to Moldavia. This meant that the Russians could no longer make use of the Danube. Nicholas was succeeded by his son, Alexander II. He knew that the country was in serious need of reform, and that the most pressing problem was that of serfdom, which was essentially slavery in another name. Its perpetuation made Russia look culturally backward in the eyes of the world. Alexander was determined to do something about it. He held a meeting with the Russian elite when he made it plain that the existing system of serfdom could not continue. If it was not eradicated from the top, he warned them, it would be abolished from below by way of revolution. Over the next few years, conditions were worked out as to how emancipation of the serfs would be accomplished. Then, in 1861, Alexander issued his Emancipation Manifesto that put in place the path to freedom for the millions of serfs, by which they could eventually buy the land that they worked on. At the start, the serfs were overjoyed, but when they realized how long it would take them to earn enough money to buy the land, they began to hold protest meetings. radical elements tried to assassinate the Tsar. Alexander reacted by cracking down on the freedoms that he had promised previously. Liberal reforms were curtailed, and the numbers of the secret police were enlarged. In 1867, Russia sold Alaska to the United States for $7.2 million. 5 years later, they entered into a partnership with Germany and Austria. It was known as the League of Three Emperors. Secure with the backing of these powers, Alexander then began rebuilding his navy in the Black Sea. Then, in 1877, another of the seemingly endless round of series of wars with the Ottoman Empire broke out. The Russians pushed the Ottomans back in both the Balkans and the Caucasus, and before long, they were once again in control of the fortress of Kars. By the spring of 1878, they were at the gates of Constantinople. It was at this point that Britain came to the aid of the Turks. This saved the Ottomans and resulted in the signing of the Treaty of San Stefano in March 1878. On March 1, 1881, an anarchist threw a bomb under Alexander's horse-drawn carriage as it passed over the Catherine Canal. The Tsar was not harmed and stepped out of the carriage to check on those who were with them. The assassin seized the opportunity and threw a second bomb. This time, Alexander was directly hit and killed. The murdered monarch was succeeded by his son, Alexander III. Enraged at the assassination of his father, he set out to quash all revolution activity throughout the land. He ruled with an iron fist, making full use of encouraging them to infiltrate all aspects of daily Russian life. However, during the reign of Alexander III, many technological and cultural innovations were introduced. Foremost among these was a new rail network that connected distant parts of the empire. In 1891, work was begun on the Trans-Siberian Railroad, connecting one end of Russia to the other. Alexander introduced what was known as his Russification policy, by which minority groups within the empire were forced to speak the Russian language, practice Russian religion, and observe Russian customs. Alexander died in 1894 due to acute nephritis. He was succeeded by his son Nicholas II. He proved to be far more sensitive and sentimental than his father had been. He was also lacking the confidence and character that was needed of a statesman. As a result, he relied heavily on those around him to run his court for him. In November 1894, he married a German princess named Alexandra, who was far more forthright and determined than her husband. The new Tsarina was not well received by the Russian people. This led her to insist that she and Nicholas remove themselves from St. Petersburg and live in a rural estate some 15 miles out of the city. This only made the Tsar more distant from his court and his people. The coronation ceremony for Nicholas did not occur until May 14, 1896. 4 days later, there was another celebration held in Moscow, during which the peasant classes were provided with free food and gifts. Around 500,000 people turned up, far more than had been expected. The situation got out of hand and a stampede resulted, in which thousands of people were killed. 3 daughters were born to the couple between 1897 and 1901. By that stage, they had both become concerned that no male heir had been conceived. The distressed Tsarina turned to the more mystical elements of the Russian Orthodox Church. It was suggested that she get her husband to canonize a popular monk who had died in 1833. Shortly after Nicholas did so, Alexandra became pregnant. She gave birth to a son who was named Alexei. However, the child suffered from hemophilia. Alexandra turned to Russian mysticism to find a cure. This led her to a Russian holy man named Grigory Rasputin. She quickly came under his spell, convinced that he could cure her son. Rasputin, however, was not the sort of person who belonged in the inner chambers of the imperial court. He was a terrible drunk and an even worse womanizer. Many people became alarmed at the influence that the mad monk was having on the Tsar and Tsarina. Meanwhile, an international crisis confronted Nicholas when the Empire of Japan launched a surprise attack on the Russian naval base at Port Arthur. Nicholas sent his Baltic fleet to Port Arthur. En route, however, they mistook a British fishing vessel for a Japanese ship and fired upon it. This resulted in the British refusing to cooperate with Russia and denying them access to the Suez Canal. This delayed the Russian fleet for so long that they were effectively out of action. Nicholas wanted to send the army against the Japanese, but when insurrections erupted at the bungling of the navy, he decided to sue for peace. By the Treaty of Portsmouth, the Russians were forced to renounce any further claims in the Far East. By now, the Russian people were beyond exasperated at the bungling leadership of the empire. In January 1905, revolution broke out, with 150,000 protesters taking to the streets of St. Petersburg. The mob marched all the way to the steps of Tsar Nicholas's Winter Palace. At some point, one of the palace guards fired on the crowd. This was the catalyst for a massacre which left more than 1,000 people dead. A massive industrial strike followed the massacre, bringing the country to its knees. Nicholas was forced to issue his October Manifesto, which created a Duma, or parliament, and limited the powers of the monarchy. It seemed as if the empire was on the path to becoming a constitutional monarchy. Within a year, however, the Tsar was trying to pull back control. He dismissed Dumas that he didn't agree with, and sought to control its members. However, with no international wars in the decade following the conflict with Japan, it looked as if the empire might survive. Then came the First World War. At the start of the war, there was great enthusiasm among the Russian people for the conflict. Initial success was achieved against the Ottoman Turks, but it was a different story on the Western Front. There, Russian losses averaged 150,000 men per month. Meanwhile, inflation back home had gone through the roof. With revolution on everyone's lips, Nicholas abdicated the throne on March 2, 1917. He named his brother, Grand Duke Michael, as the new Tsar. Michael, however, turned down the title. Within 6 months, the communist revolution was unleashed. The Winter Palace was stormed on November 7, 1917. Nicholas and his family were taken captive and confined in Siberia. On July 17, 1918, the entire family was slaughtered. It was the final death knell of the once mighty Russian Empire.